All right. There's a few things I definitely want to cover today. So if we go a little bit longer on time, then I hope you be patient with me. I don't know. I might be able to fit it in. I definitely better stop jabbering if I want to fit it all in now. One announcement: there will not be class next Tuesday. I will figure out what I'm going to do. More than likely, I will prepare a video that will be like a class lecture, except, obviously, I will not be there in person. All right. So the things I want to do today are I want to do more about getting data out of forms, and doing something with it, because we can do math on stuff from forms too. All right. So that's one thing. Second thing I want to do is actually using JavaScript to create HTML. Because if you looked at the coin assignment, you need to do both those things, right? You need to be able to grab the values from the different form elements and do a calculation. Then you need to create image tags. And I'm going to show you the easy way, and I'm going to show you the harder but better way. All right, so that's my goal for today, to sort of sketch it out. So let's look at this example. This example is pretty simplistic. I have the number of hours someone works and whether they are an associate or a trainee. And they get paid differently depending on their position. There's this different hourly rate. Now, this is not likely something you would actually do in JavaScript. This is probably something you would do on server side, because that information would probably be on the server. But we're going to do it just as an illustration. We'd call it something like a paycheck estimator or something like that. All right. So you put in the number of hours that they work. You put in whether they're an associate or a trainee, and it shows you what their gross pay is. If they're a trainee, oh, I have manager, associate, and trainee. I'm sorry, I only saw the two. If they're an associate, and if they're a trainee. So it's $10, $12, and $15 per hour. Let's put over 40 hours in. So over 40 hours is 550. How did I calculate that? Well, 40 hours at straight time, so that would be 400, plus 10 hours at, is this right? We'll have to look at the code. 40 hours at $10 would be $400, plus, oh yeah, plus the other 10 at time and a half, right? I was forgetting about the time and a half bit. And yeah, that would be an extra 150. Now, a manager or an associate also gets paid overtime, so I assume that calculation is correct. And finally, a manager does not get paid overtime. All right, so let's look at the code that produced this. And here's the parts I want you to get from this. How to pull data out of the text box. How to pull which radio button is selected. We're going to do it with a radio button first. After we get that going, we're going to change it to a drop down, because those two controls are sort of interchangeable. All right. It depends largely on how many values you have. If it's a radio button, you better not have more than, I don't know, 4 or 5. I don't know. If you had 100 radio buttons, that wouldn't be good. But 100 elements in a drop down might be okay. All right, so let's look at the code here. Oh, one thing I wanted to check, do I validate this? because, you know, sort of like the first rule of programming, or in the top 3 rules of programming, is if the user can enter data, you better validate it. So we go here and we type garbage in here, and if we forget to select the radio button, it does display error messages. Must enter a number in for hours, must choose job type. If I leave it blank, oh, interesting. Bit of a bug here. That's the same situation we took care of last time. If you remember, we did the trim on the field. So we'll make that change here too. But it does do some validation, thank goodness. And let's look. All right, on our button, on the click of the button, we process form. Notice that that is a button and not a submit button. Usually one time a semester, I'll have someone ask me like, why when I press the button, nothing happens, it just sort of reloads. And that's because if you have a submit button there, you have to take the extra step to return false to keep it from submitting. Long story, but instead, what you'd do is you would have validation that is triggered by a button, because everything's going to be done via JavaScript. So we click on the button, we execute process form. Process form does this. Now, this is one thing I've done, is I've broken it down into functions. All right. We know functions are useful if we want to reuse the code. The other thing that functions are very useful for is to help us modularize the code. That is, take a big task and break it down into little tasks. All right. For one thing, it's very easy to debug. It's easier to debug that way. All right. If you're looking at a long string of so many, so many statements, then it's very difficult to debug. How long should a function be before you consider breaking it into 2 parts? The one rule of thumb that I heard is that it should, you should be able to see the entire function on the screen. That's sort of a goal. I don't know if I achieved that here or not, but that's sort of a goal. I'm bigger. I have a bigger font now. Let me put it back down to a normal font. That's probably a normal font. I'm a little bit longer. So I probably could trim this down a little bit more, but I'm close. All right. Oh, wait a minute. I'm very close. I only have a couple of statements overhanging. And if I got rid of some of these blank lines that were superfluously put in, I might be able to make it. All right, anyhow. This function, first we're going to validate the form, and then we're going to calculate the results if validate form is true. All right. If validate form is true, we're going to calculate the results. If not, we're not going to do anything. All right. Makes sense. Remember, validate form is calling the function validate form, which is going to return a Boolean, true or false. So if the Boolean that it returns is true, we're going to continue and process the form. If the Boolean it returns is false, we're going to get out and not process the form. Now, here's another nice thing about writing it this way. I can approach the problem in a small piece at a time. All right. For example, if I wanted to, I could say, you know what? I'm not going to worry about validation right now. and I would have my validation function simply always return true. All right. I could cut all that. Well, I wouldn't cut the code out, but if I didn't have that code there, I could just make it return true. And I'll just say, well, make a note to myself, I have to add validation in. But I could go in and test the rest of the program. All right. In the old days, and I think even now, we called those stub functions. Stub function is where you don't have, you sort of have a placeholder for the function. You don't have the entire logic in, but you like do what you need to do, like to return the proper value or do a version of the calculation. Maybe, for example, when I was first debugging this, I could have had the calculation always be $10 per hour without looking at the type. And then I can incorporate that in. The biggest problem I see among students, and I'm not talking about you folks, but the biggest problem I see among students is trying to do the entire thing all at once. And I get it, right? You know, you want to get the assignment done and turned in, right? That's a valid goal. However, this is a case of taking the shortcut ends up being longer all the way around, right? Because if you try to get everything done, you're going to have a giant slab of code that's going to be very hard to test, debug, and so on. It's much better if things are broken down into little pieces. So if something's wrong with validate form, boom, I look at just that function and I decide. I don't have to touch the rest of it. Or if I need to change something, I just change the validate form function. All right. So validate form, what does it do? It sets the inner HTML of errors to an empty string. What is the inner HTML? The inner HTML is the space between this beginning and ending tag. Initially, there's nothing there because the first time the page loads, we haven't done a calculation. So therefore, that's an empty string. So before we start processing a new calculation, we blank out what was ever there before. All right, so that we can put the new value in. And we blank it out so in case there's an error, we don't give deceiving results. All right, deceptive results. So inner HTML is one way that we can create or change the HTML on the page. And we'll see this again later on in a couple minutes here. We assume that it's true. I'm going to concatenate all the error strings together into a gigantic error message string that's going to consist of HTML tags. So I'm initializing that error message as an unordered list. I then grab the value from the text box. That's what txt hours is. How do I grab a value from the text box? Document get element by ID txt hours.value. Now there's another way to do that. Remember we talked about last time by using the form array and the array of elements within the form. I tend to prefer doing it this way. All right, I don't know, 6 of one, half does the other. I've not heard a good argument why one way is better than the other. All right, so I would use the ID. I look to see if the hours is an empty string. And I might as well correct that right now and refresh my memory on the trim function. All right, so I now look to see if when I trim it, there's nothing left. All right, now I put this in a variable. I don't have to do that, but if I didn't do that, I would have to have this long expression everywhere I'm using the value for hours, and that wouldn't be too good. All right, so hours trim, if that equals the spaces, then I have an error. I set B value to false, and I concatenate an LI tag to the end of my error message. So let's say we do have an error. I've set B valid to false, and I've set the error message to the UL tag plus this new LI tag. Otherwise, I do this. I look to see if it's not a number. That's what is NaN means. It's checking to see if the value in that string is a valid number or not. The weird thing about JavaScript is that it's what is called weakly typed. In other words, you have a string that you can treat like a number if it is a number. All right. JavaScript sort of figures it out. All right. Which is kind of cool in some respects, but it's kind of dangerous in other respects. So at any rate, we can look to see if that string contains a number. If not, we concatenate a different error message, must enter a number. Finally, we look to make sure that the number is not negative. And we display a different error message. So in all these cases, if there's a problem with that hours field, we create an error message, we concatenate a new LI to the error message that we're accumulating. Notice the type is entirely outside of the if statement for the hours. I want to test those independently because I don't want to have a case of if I get one error, it displays that and doesn't display anything else. All right. I want to display all the errors. So my tests are one step at a time, individual. And I look and I see if GetType is an empty string, then B valid is false. Error message equals error message plus must choose a job type. Now here's what's nice, even in discussing this, right? GetType is a function. We'll look at that function in a minute. But right now, while I'm looking at the validate form function, we don't have to worry about that. We can just trust that it works. All right. In a minute, we'll look at it in more detail. But if you were a programmer and you had to change something about the validation, you wouldn't have all the code that tests the type. You wouldn't have that as part of the flow here, sort of muddying up the waters. So finally, I add an AND UL to my error message. Remember, because I started off with the UL, I may have added some LIs, so I need to end the unordered list. Finally, if B valid equals false, I find the section of the page called errors, and which is a div down here, I believe, or a section down here. And I set the InnerHTML to error message. So think about it. I have a string in memory that corresponds to a UL tag with different LIs associated with it. I get down here and I say to put the error message in here. That's going to plot right here that string that contains those HTML codes. And the browser interprets that as valid HTML and displays it. All right. So this is the first case of us not just changing the CSS or changing an attribute of the HTML, but actually changing the HTML code, which we can do. One thing I probably should do. Oh, I did it. I set errors to an empty string. Good. Any questions about this function? So there's two outcomes from this function. All right. The form is valid or it's not. If it's valid, it returns true and it does not update that error section. If it's not valid, it returns false, and it does update that error section. What does it update the error section with? It accumulates an unordered list. If it's valid, we continue to calculate results. Now, let's look at GetType. I can do this, well, it's almost useless to say, but I can do this a couple different ways. One way I could do it is I could check the IDs. These all have IDs, so I could say if RB associate is checked. All right, so I could do something like that. That would look to see if this button is checked or not. So I could do that. The problem is I'd have to do that for all the other ones. Right? I'd have to check associate, manager, and trainee. Well, for 3 radio buttons, that might not be that big a deal. And if you did it that way, I doubt I would complain about it. All right. However, a better way to do this is to write it so that no matter how many radio buttons there are, it validates all of them. When I say better, what do I mean? What do you hear in your head when I say better? Any thoughts? Yes. Yeah, the code will be more flexible, scalable. I would summarize it in one word. And I always tell my classes this. If I ask something in class and you don't know the answer, shout out maintainability. All right? Because that's why we do so many things in programming, is to make our code more maintainable. All right? It's really the result of all good practices. So if I say it's better to do it this way than that way, it means that the way that I said is better is probably easier to change. All right, that's bottom line of what I mean when I talk about maintainability, or when I talk about code being better or worse. You know, it's funny sometimes, you know, this is something that I think is hard to teach a little bit, but I've had students tell me, you know, why did you knock off a point on this assignment? It works. And I say, yeah, it works, but it's a really roundabout way to do it. And if anything changed, you'd have to change a mess of stuff in your program. All right. So yes, there are sometimes different ways to do things that are of equal value or nearly equal value. But sometimes there's clearly a better way to do it. And that's what this is. So I set the result to an empty string. I grab a pointer to that checkbox. Actually, I grab a pointer to the list of checkboxes. So I'm getting the element by name. All right, not getting by ID. What's the difference? Well, one uses a name, one uses the ID. The other difference is with a name, there's a possibility of pulling up multiple values. So you actually get back an array. So what are the things that have a name of RB type? Well, this radio button, and this radio button. Okay? These 3 radio buttons all have a name of RB type. So my array is going to contain those 3 elements. So now what I do is I loop through those elements. I create a for loop, starting I at 0, because that's what arrays start with. doing it until, as long as the I is less than the length of this array, because that's what that returns, is an array, and I increment I by 1 each time. In the loop, I test to see if that checkbox that I'm looking at in the loop is checked. If it's checked, I grab the value of that. So in other words, if manager was checked, I grab the M. If associate was checked, I grab the A. If trainee was checked, I grab the T. If none of those are checked, then result still has a value of spaces, or I'm sorry, an empty string, and I can return the result. And what do? I test to see if it's an empty string. If it's an empty string, that means a problem. All right. Questions about this so far? So we're done validating the form. We're now going to calculate the result. And the nice thing is that calculate result doesn't need to worry about validation. You know, you can just do its thing. Because if there was a problem, the validate form should have found it. All right. Now, you want to test that, right? You want to test to make sure if you enter in an alphabetic character or if you enter in a negative number or whatever, that it doesn't go and calculate it. But if you did your job right on the validate form method, then calculating it should go without the need for any further validation. Calculate results. I grab the hours from txt hours. I initialize the rate at 0. I get the type again. So there's 2 places in the code I need to get the type. So it's great that it's in a function, so I don't have to duplicate it. Now there's other ways to do it, but this is the way that I chose. I get the rate by calling getRate. All right? Very isolated code. If there's a different way to calculate the rate, I can do it. And then finally, I multiply the gross pay times the hours rate. And then finally, I see if they're an associate or a trainee. If they are, and they've worked more than 40 hours, I calculate their overtime by this formula. I give them 50% more for all the hours over 40 hours. And then I finally display that in the place on the string that has an ID of result, which is that span. Let's look at get rate. I initialize it to 0. If one of these is checked, if the archetype is checked, if the archetype is M, I know they're a manager, and the result is $15 per hour. Associate, $12, trainee, $10. So that gets returned, and I continue on and do the calculation. Questions about this? All right, excellent. Now, we're going to do 2 things. All right. We are going to, excuse me, we are going to change the radio buttons to a drop down. So, goodbye to this. Hello to this. We talked about these in CISS216, and we said that the value is what the program needs, either the server-side program or the client-side program. So if they haven't selected anything, we want to return an empty string. We also want to spell option correctly. And we have a manager. We have an associate, and we have a trainee. Remember, what's between the option tag is the description that the user is going to see. Okay, manager, associate, trainee. Now, we're going to have to change the GetType method. All right? But guess what? We don't have to change everything about it. All right? I could actually do it a couple different ways. You're probably tired of hearing me say that. I'll do it two different ways. The first way is going to involve not even changing this. I'm going to grab the things that have a name of RB type. Well, guess what? There's only one. So I should be able to say, there's no isChecked attribute of a dropdown. There's simply a value. So I would say result equals RBS, I think sub-zero dot value. We'll test it out and see if it works. Again, the benefit of modularizing this and putting things in their own place. Putting code in its own place. If I do that and save it, I have a drop down. If I don't pick anything, I get an error. If I type in 40 hours and a manager, gives me the right answer. So how cool is that? You don't have to go in the middle of this gigantic function and find the lines you have to change. Change in one place. And that code is isolated. If we look at this code, what was there before, I can easily display it on one screen. So I can know and I can gut it and do whatever I want. Now there's an alternative way of doing this. And I could do this. I could use the ID to get it. And I can simply say dot value, just like I did with the text box. And that should work as well. And sure enough, it does. Yay. So we've done most of what I wanted to talk about today. There's one more thing. I mentioned that there is a better way to set the HTML other than using InnerHTML. InnerHTML is dangerous because you could put anything in that string. And so therefore you could put a tag that isn't valid in that string. And you could send it to the browser and the browser is going to try to do it. All right. What I want to do is I want to, let's do this. In the error place, let's put either a check mark if they've entered data correctly or an X if they didn't enter data correctly. All right. Do we want to do that? Yeah, we want to do that. I'm going to go out to Google Images and find a nice image of a check mark. I am going to find one that is called green check mark. And now I want to put a image of X. I'm going to go and rename these and put them in the right folder. Okay. They're renamed. I'm going to copy them. Put it in here. Now, I don't want to mess up what I'm doing with errors. So I'm going to create a different section for the graphic. So I'm going to call this section ID equals graphic. And we're going to put nothing in there. All right. So I feel like a starship commander up here with this whole giant console in front of me. And this is like a captain seat. So it's kind of cool. All right. I could put this in several places. I'm going to put it here. If it's valid, I want to display check mark. Else, display X. So I'm going to create a function called display image. and I'm going to give it the name of the image I want to display. So I call it valid.jpg. Why'd I do that? Well, because creating an image is same for the X as it is for the check mark. Only thing that's different is what? Is the source file for the image. All right, so I'll put create image down or display image down here. Probably should make this a capital D because it is a function. Now, first thing I want to do is I want to create an image object. All right. What do I mean by an image object? I mean an image element. All right. I'm going to create that image, which is an HTML block. All right. In the DOM. All right. It's going to translate to an HTML block in the DOM. And or another more accurate way to say it, I'm going to create a node in the HTML tree. So I'm going to say, and again, I have to check the syntax of this. Var image equals create element image. All right. So I'm creating an element called image. And what's more, I'm creating it of type image. So now there is an image object, and it's floating in space, if you will. It's not on my web page yet. I want to set an attribute of that image. What attribute do I want to set? The SRC. And what do I want to set it to? I want to set it to the value of that argument. I actually should send a string so I can set the alt attribute as well. And that's going to look the same. So now I have this image object. I have this image node floating in space. It's not part of my web page yet. I have to put it on my web page. So I'm going to find this place where I want to play it or where I want to put it. And what is it called? It's called graphic. All right. So document get element by ID graphic I'm just doing that for just to show that you can grab a pointer to that space. And now I don't have to say document get element by ID, blah, 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 blah. I can just say location dot something. So I'm appending a child. What does that mean? When we have a tag, the tags inside it are considered children. So this LI has a label and an input as its children. This has a label and a select. The select has these 4 option tags and so on. By appending a child, we mean put at the very end of it, put that HTML element. Well, there's nothing in this, so it's not going to be at the very end in it. It's just going to be there. So let's save this and hope that it works. And it didn't. How am I going to figure this out? I don't know. But what I'm not going to do is stare at the code. I'm going to take a systematic approach. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look to see what the error console tells me. Create element is not defined. Rookie mistake. What did I do wrong? Well, Google said it was create element. Yeah, but Google said it was with a lowercase c. Now, no errors. I hope this will work now. Create element is not defined. Oh, second rookie mistake of the day. Where do I want to create the element? I want to use the document.create element. The create element function is part of the document. All right. And there we go with our big old X. All right. All right. Last thing that I want to talk about today, and this will go like maybe another 5 minutes, is I want to put maybe text underneath that image or alongside the image, either place. It depends on the style sheet or whatever. That either says right or wrong, or valid or invalid. All right. So text is a special kind of node. All right. So I'm going to grab the value of the alt attribute. I could also pass this as a third argument if I wanted to. And I'm going to create a text node. So if I want to just put H somewhere on the page, or text somewhere on the HTML document. And then finally, I append that on there. All right, let's test this, make sure it works. And it doesn't. Let's see. Parameter 1 is not of type node. Oh, message node. And it says invalid. All right. Now let's do this again. A second X. Is that good? No, it's not good. What do we want to do? Well, we want to sort of go and get rid of everything before we start doing things. So I'm going to say location dot remove The other thing that's nice, by the way, of doing it the second way is you can add event handlers. So I could say, I thought there was a remove all nodes, but I could say, while location dot first child. That means is as long as this node has a first child, so that's equivalent of saying any children, I can say remove it. Doesn't display multiple times. All right, I will post this example up to Canvas. Are there any other questions? Yes. Nah. In other words, you're asking, can you do this? And is there an advantage to it? Yeah, no, 6 of one, half dozen the other. Think about what you need to create a link. You'd create the node that was an A. So you'd create element A. You'd set the href attribute, either using this notation or the notation that you suggested. And then finally, you'd create a text node and put it in the link. All right. And then you'd have your link. All right. We'll see you over in lab.